Captain Jack Miller was once a legend among pilots, a man known for his calm under pressure and unmatched skills in the cockpit. But sometimes, life takes an unexpected nosedive. Years ago, during a routine flight, Jack made a bold decision to save lives during a near-catastrophic emergency. While the passenger survived, the airline didn't see Jack's actions as heroic. Instead, they branded him reckless, and his career came crashing down. Now, years later, Jack flies smaller routes, carrying the weight of his past every time he steps into the cockpit. Determined to redeem himself, he keeps his head down, focusing only on the task at hand. But the shadow of that fateful flight lingers. Questions from passengers, whispers from colleagues, and, worst of all, his own self-doubt today was supposed to be like any other day. Jack was tasked with flying Flight 215, a transatlantic journey from New York to London. The plane was fueled, the passengers were boarding, and the skies were clear. Jack greeted his co-pilot with his usual calm demeanor, exchanged small talk with the flight attendants, and prepared for takeoff. But what Jack didn't know was that this would be the flight that would change his life. Again, as the plane ascended into the clear blue sky, Jack thought about the journey ahead. For once, he hoped for an uneventful flight, a quiet shift with no surprises. But up in the clouds, far from safety, danger was already waiting. For Captain Jack Miller, Flight 215 was supposed to be routine. New York to London, 200 passengers on board, and calm weather ahead. The cockpit was buzzing with the usual pre-flight preparations. The flight attendants were greeting passengers, and the hum of the engines provided a sense of calm. But sometimes, danger hides in plain sight. Jack and his co-pilot, Rick, exchanged the usual pre-flight banter. Rick, younger and more optimistic, often looked up to Jack, admiring his experience. As the plane taxied and lifted into the sky, everything seemed ordinary. The flight attendants went through the safety briefing, and passengers settled in for the long journey across the Atlantic. But in the middle of the cabin, Sarah, the head flight attendant, began to notice something, off. Midway through the flight, as the plane soared over the Atlantic, Sarah's unease grew. One of the suspicious passengers requested to move seats, claiming they needed more space. Another fumbled with a bag under their seat, hiding something from view. Sarah calmly reported her observations to Jack through the intercom, her voice steady, but laced with concern. But before anyone could act, chaos erupted. Several passengers stood up simultaneously, pulling out concealed weapons. "This is a hijacking!" One of them shouted, their voice sharp and commanding. The cabin turned to panic as passengers screamed, and the hijackers began taking control of the aisle. Back in the cockpit, Jack and Rick locked the doors immediately, ensuring the hijackers couldn't enter. Jack's years of experience kicked in, his voice calm but firm as he assessed the situation. The hijackers began issuing demands through the intercom. They wanted the planer routed to an undisclosed location, but Jack wasn't about to let them take control without a fight. In just moments, the quiet hum of Flight 215 had turned into chaos. Jack was now locked in a deadly game with the hijackers, facing the impossible task of protecting his crew, his passengers, and his plane. But little did he know, this hijacking was far more than it seemed. It was the beginning of a much larger conspiracy. The hijackers had taken control of the cabin, their leader stepping forward to address the terrified passengers. "Stay in your seats and no one gets hurt," he barked, his voice cold and commanding. Panic rippled through the cabin, but the hijackers moved with precision. This wasn't their first time. They were organized, prepared, and utterly ruthless. In the cockpit, Jack and Rick worked quickly. With the hijackers' demands booming through the intercom, Jack locked down the ISU cockpit systems, ensuring no one could override the controls. The tension between the two pilots was palpable. Rick, younger and less experienced, looked to Jack for reassurance. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jack's response was calm but firm. "We keep this plane in the air and buy ourselves time." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Sarah was doing everything she could to maintain order. She moved quietly between the rows, reassuring passengers with a calm but determined presence. One elderly passenger began hyperventilating, and Sarah knelt beside her, whispering words of comfort, all while keeping a watchful eye on the hijackers. But Sarah wasn't just trying to calm the passengers. She was gathering critical information. The hijackers made their first official demand. Jack must reroute the plane to a remote airstrip. Their leader, speaking through the intercom, made it clear they weren't bluffing. "Do as we say, Captain, or people will die." But Jack wasn't convinced. Something about their behavior didn't add up. They didn't seem interested in ransom or political demands. There was something else driving them. As Jack stalled for time, pretending to consider their demands, Sarah made a critical discovery. One of the hijackers had dropped a tablet during the chaos. Using her quick thinking, Sarah managed to retrieve it and hide it in the galley. When she accessed the device, the truth began to surface. This wasn't a random hijacking. The group was after someone, or something, on board. It was becoming clear that this hijacking was no ordinary act of terror. Jack and Sarah were uncovering pieces of a puzzle far larger than they imagined. The lives of 200 passengers hung in the balance, but the stakes were higher than anyone could have foreseen. Jack's instincts told him one thing: whoever the hijackers were after, they would stop at nothing to get it. While the hijackers tightened their grip on the cabin, Sarah's discovery in the galley began to reveal the truth. The tablet she retrieved wasn't just a random piece of equipment. It held encrypted files and confidential communications. As Sarah relayed her findings to Jack over the intercom, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. These hijackers weren't just after money or political leverage. They were on a mission to eliminate someone on board. A whistleblower, carrying sensitive evidence that could expose a major corporate scandal. The files on the tablet revealed messages from a powerful corporation, detailing orders to retrieve the whistleblower and destroy the evidence at all costs. Suddenly, the stakes were even higher. The hijackers weren't just endangering the passengers, they were hunting a specific target. Jack and Sarah realized they had to protect the whistleblower while keeping the hijackers in check. But there was one problem. No one knew which passenger it was. As the hijackers grew more aggressive, time was running out. The leader demanded updates from Jack, threatening violence if their demands weren't met. But Jack knew he couldn't comply, not with the lives of his passengers and the whistleblower at stake. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. As the tension in the cabin reached a boiling point, the whistleblower finally revealed themselves. A nervous passenger, seated in the middle of the cabin, stood up, their hands trembling as they clutched a briefcase. "Please," they said, their voice shaky but resolute. "You don't understand what's at stake. The world needs to see this." The hijackers turned their focus on them, and the situation grew even more dangerous. The hijackers now had their target, but Jack and Sarah weren't about to let them succeed. The evidence in that briefcase could expose corruption on a massive scale, but the price of protecting it was rising by the second. With the whistleblower's life in immediate danger and the plane running out of time, Jack knew the next decisions. He made could mean the difference between survival and disaster. With the hijackers focused on the whistleblower, the tension aboard Flight 215 was reaching a boiling point. Jack Miller sat in the cockpit, staring at the storm ahead, his mind racing through every possible scenario. The plane's communication systems had been sabotaged, fuel levels were dropping, and now they were heading straight into a dangerous weather system. Jack knew this wasn't just a hijacking anymore. This was a race against time back in the cabin. The hijackers tightened their control. Their leader, furious with Jack for stalling, made a chilling announcement over the intercom. "If you don't comply, Captain, people will start dying." The passengers were paralyzed with fear, but Sarah remained calm. She quietly moved through the cabin, signaling passengers to stay still while keeping a close eye on the whistleblower. Suddenly, the plane lurched as turbulence from the storm rattled the cabin. Passengers screamed, and even the hijackers struggled to maintain their balance. Jack had intentionally flown into the edge of the storm, using the turbulence as a way to destabilize the hijackers and buy time. It was a risky move, but it gave Sarah the opening she needed as the plane trembled through the storm. The whistleblower broke down. "You don't understand," they cried. "This evidence could bring down one of the most corrupt corporations in the world. They'll stop at nothing to destroy it, even if it means killing everyone on this plane." The hijackers' leader turned to them, their voice cold and calculating. "And that's exactly what we'll do." With time running out, Jack came up with a daring plan. He would perform a series of dangerous maneuvers, taking the plane deeper into the storm to disorient the hijackers and give Sarah and the passengers a chance to fight back. It was a gamble that could either save everyone or doom them all. With the storm raging outside and the hijackers growing desperate, the passengers of Flight 215 found themselves at the edge of disaster. Jack's bold maneuvers gave them a glimmer of hope, but the plane was now on the brink of catastrophe. The next few moments would decide the fate of everyone on board. The storm outside was relentless, shaking Flight 215 like a leaf in the wind. Inside, the tension had reached its peak. Jack Miller, at the controls, pushed his piloting skills to the limit, performing daring maneuvers to keep the plane stable, while throwing the hijackers off balance. In the cabin, Sarah and a small group of passengers prepared to take a stand. The time for action had come. With a sudden jolt, Jack pitched the plane into a sharp dive, sending the hijackers sprawling. The leader shouted orders, trying to regain control, but it was too late. Sarah and her team of passengers launched their attack, catching the hijackers by surprise. Back in the cockpit, Jack's plan was working, but it wasn't over yet. The hijackers' leader, realizing they were losing control of the cabin, made a desperate move. They charged towards the cockpit, pounding on the reinforced door, shouting threats. Jack's co-pilot, Rick, looked at him nervously. "What do we do if they get in?" he asked. Jack's answer was simple. They won't. In the cabin, the passengers had the upper hand. Sarah and her team managed to disarm the hijackers, securing their weapons and tying them up with anything they could find. Seatbelt extenders, ties, even headphone cables. But the leader wasn't done yet. Breaking away from the chaos, they grabbed the whistleblower and held them at gunpoint, dragging them toward the cockpit. In the cockpit, Jack made a split-second decision. He disengaged autopilot and performed a risky maneuver, sharply tilting the plane. The sudden movement threw everyone off balance, causing the leader to stumble and release the whistleblower. Sarah and another passenger seized the moment, tackling the leader to the ground and securing them once and for all. With the hijackers neutralized and the passengers safe, Jack's attention turned to the next challenge, landing the plane. The storm had taken a toll on the aircraft, and fuel levels were dangerously low. Jack needed to find a safe place to land, and fast against all odds, Jack and Sarah had managed to reclaim control of the plane. But the battle wasn't over yet. With the storm behind them and limited fuel ahead, the final test was still to come. Landing Flight 215 safely and bringing everyone home. With the hijackers defeated, the passengers safe, and the storm clearing ahead, Jack Miller faced his final challenge, bringing Flight 215 home. The aircraft was running on fumes, its systems damaged from the turbulence. Jack had spotted a small, isolated airstrip on the radar, a risky but possible place to land. This was his only chance. As the plane approached the airstrip, Jack called out to the cabin, "Brace for landing!" Sarah and her crew moved quickly, ensuring every passenger was secured. The passengers, though shaken and exhausted, held on tightly, their fear palpable but mixed with hope. The plane descended rapidly, its engines whining under the strain. Jack's hands moved instinctively across the controls, making split-second adjustments to keep the aircraft steady. Finally, with a screech of metal and sparks flying, the plane touched down. The tires screamed as they hit the tarmac, but Jack's precision paid off. The plane came to a halt, just feet from the edge of the airstrip. The passengers disembarked. The sound of emergency vehicles filled the air. Authorities stormed the plane, taking the hijackers into custody. The whistleblower, still clutching their briefcase, thanked Jack and Sarah with tears in their eyes. "You saved more than just my life today," they said. "You saved the truth for Jack." This flight wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. Years ago, a single decision had cost him his reputation. Today, his courage, skill, and determination proved to the world, and to himself, that he was the hero he was always meant to be. Flight 215 had begun as just another routine trip, but it became a journey of survival, courage, and redemption. Jack Miller had faced the ultimate test, saving not only his passengers, but also himself. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Jack knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the hardest turbulence leads to the clearest skies.